Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Scott Carver. He's a lecturer in wildlife ecology at University of Tasmania, and he specializes in the ecology and epidemiology of infectious diseases that occur to wildlife and in domestic animals, and how it affects humans. So, Scott, thanks for coming. How you doing?
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, what got you interested in looking at ecology and epidemiology of wildlife animals and how they affect people?
Well, I guess for me, it started probably back when I was doing my undergraduate degree. I've always had a bent towards sort of working with animals and animal sort of conservation, and during some of my master's studies, I really got sort of interested in these ideas around sort of connecting sort of ecosystem health with the health of animals and also the health of humans as well, and that led me on to a PhD. Working on mosquito-borne disease ecology, and then ultimately moving on to other sort of wildlife disease systems in different parts of the world.
So, what I would think you'd have to focus on certain animals or certain parts of the ecology. Like, what is your focus? Is it habitats? Is it disease? Is it and what animals?
It's really disease, and I have a few systems that I generally work with now. Now that I have a stable sort of academic job, a lot of my research now focuses on wombats that are impacted by this disease called Sarcoptic Mange. But I also do and have done a lot of work in the US working on viral transmission of a variety of different viruses in bobcats and mountain lions and domestic cats. And then I still tinker around the edges with a bit of mosquito-borne disease ecology in Australia, where I work on a virus called Ross River virus, which cycles between marsupials and spills over to humans. And then there's a few other things like koalas that get impacted by a chlamydial disease. So I've worked on lots of different things, and that's just what I work on now. I've also worked on hantaviruses in the US, which are spread by small mouse and other things as well.
Yeah, and koalas, I've heard that there's a virus that's like endogenizing. It's becoming part of their DNA, and it's changing over the entire population of them. Am I right about that? Is that what's happening, or is it something different?
No, that's absolutely correct. So there's a virus that they have that's called Koala retrovirus, or abbreviated, people call it CORV, and it seems to have been introduced in sort of the northern part of their range in Queensland, and has been sort of moving steadily south in koalas, and as it has been doing that, it's been endogenizing into the genome. It is quite a complicated picture. So people think that the virus has some health impacts on koalas, but it might be down to particular kinds of strains, and there's lots of threats to koalas, like habitat destruction and also chlamydial disease and interactions with dogs and things like that. So it's quite a complex picture, but that is certainly one of their major diseases of interest.
Well, what's it doing to them? Is it killing them, or is it just changing them in some unknown way?
With it being a retrovirus, it probably its major effect is through influencing the immune system. So it's still fairly unclear, to be completely honest. But I think the greatest understanding is that it sort of has some effects in terms of sort of compromising their immune responses and making them more susceptible to other forms of health risks and things like that. So there's still much to be learned there. It's an interesting disease that I think is sort of not entirely well understood yet.
So what for where you are right now, are you looking now? I mean, I guess it probably has your attention been forced to look at local animals local ecology because of the coronavirus and shutdowns and localization of everything, or like what's your work right now at this moment?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, right at the moment, and for the last few years, it's really I've had a growing focus on wombats, which are these wonderful Australian marsupials that live down burrows and come out and feed at night time and spend a lot of time sleeping, quite like koalas as well. And they get really smashed by this disease called Sarcoptic Mange, which was introduced to Australia by European settlers and their domestic animals about a couple of hundred years ago. And so it's sometimes a conservation issue in Australia, so it can cause population declines, but it's kind of an animal welfare issue, so populations can sustain with the disease, but the suffering at an individual level is quite horrendous to wombats. And so a lot of my research these days is geared around trying to find disease management solutions to this in wombats and other animals. This disease impacts over 100 species of mammal globally, including humans. And then which is a fairly complicated business, but I think we've got some real chances to really make some positive gains for these animals.
What role do they play in the ecology? They look like hamster dogs, I guess, if you mix the two together.
Yeah, they certainly do. They're not too small. They weigh up. Your average adult wombat weighs about 20 kilograms, which I guess is about 50 pounds, and they can move pretty quickly over short distances. So I've certainly been outrun by wombats on many an occasion. In terms of the ecosystem, the herbivores, they graze on grasses predominantly, and they're kind of minor ecosystem engineers. So they dig these burrows that they live in, and they'll dig a variety of other burrows, and lots of other animals utilize those burrows. There was some media when they had the big bushfires in Australia earlier this year of other animals utilizing wombat burrows, and that's actually quite common, that other animals will use wombat burrows for shelter, and they also just kind of turn over the topsoil quite often as well. So they'll often eat grass roots, and they've got sort of these big sort of powerful arms and claws on their forepaws that they can use for just kind of like tearing through the top few centimeters of soil and kind of eating grass roots to obtain carbohydrates.
So what are they preyed upon? I mean, they just eat grasses and everything, and they make these holes. I mean, do they help fields turn over? Do they attack crops? I mean, like in terms of humans and wombats, what's the interaction there? And again, what eats them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they in Tasmania, one of the animals that eats wombats is the Tasmanian devil. So it's a native marsupial carnivore. And on the Australian mainland, it's mostly things like dingoes and wild dogs. There's not too many things that eat wombats, and they're quite well. They've got quite good defenses. So wombats, when they sense a predator, they'll run down a burrow and they'll stand in the tunnel of their burrow, and they have this hardened skin on their backside, which is very difficult for an animal to bite at or to get around. So wombats basically kind of block the hole like a plug to stop predators from eating them. And they're quite well known for occasionally actually killing things like a fox or an animal that tries to get over the top of a burrow, the wombat in a burrow, and they've got very powerful legs, so they'll stand up and they'll actually squash the animal against the roof of the burrow and basically suffocate them by compressing their airway. So they've got sort of these sort of quite amazing defenses. And I guess at an ecosystem level, in terms of the impacts that they have for other animals, it's definitely nutrient turnover of the soil and providing shelters for other animals as well. Not deliberately providing shelters for other animals, but because they dig a lot of burrows, other animals tend to use them as well.
Okay. So the disease that's affecting them, what does it do to the wombats? And again, I don't know. I would wonder, sadly, if it's hard to get any funding to study this, because if they're not directly affecting people, sadly they may not care, or they may think other animals are priorities.
Yeah. Yes, I'll come on to. Actually, I didn't really complete your former question, so I might answer that just a little bit more if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So in terms of interactions with humans, wombats, the most of the sort of negative interactions is where they are near farming rural properties, and excuse me, and they go out onto pasture land and consume grass there. Which they don't consume huge amounts, but wombats are kind of like little bulldozers, and they're really quite good at like pushing through and underneath fences, which lets in other marsupials. And so a lot of their conflict with humans comes in the agricultural areas through impacting the integrity of farming fences, or sometimes even undermining them by digging burrows around them. And I guess probably their other main threat with humans is that they're not very good with vehicles on the roadway. So wombats occasionally get hit by a car, which usually does a reasonable amount of damage both to the wombat and the car, because they're fairly solid creatures. Right.
How big are they? Like, how much do they weigh and everything?
They weigh about 20 kilograms, an average adult wombat, so it's about 50 pounds. But they can get up to close to 40 kilograms at the biggest size. So they're not too small.
Are they at all similar to capybaras? I know those are like giant rodents, but they seem, I guess, a little bit similar. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, morphologically, they're pretty similar in size to a capybara, yeah.
Okay, but other than that, they're not similar at all, right?
No, they're not social. In fact, they're antisocial. Wombats are kind of like grumpy, solitary loners, is I think the way I would describe them. There's as juveniles, they stick with their mum very closely, but then they turn into teenagers, and then they want nothing to do with each other, just about. So they're mostly, you find one wombat lives down a burrow on its own. And of course they interact to mate with one another, but otherwise they don't really even seem to like each other. So they're quite entertaining. I should talk about this disease, shouldn't I? So,
yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So wombats are impacted by this disease called Sarcoptic Mange, and it causes really quite severe sort of symptoms. So humans also can get this disease. It's called scabies when humans get it, and so can domestic dogs, and it's perhaps best well known for that. And wombats get what we call crusted mange or crusted scabies, which is really the most severe form of the disease, where they have what we'd call a type 4 inflammatory response, or you might even call it an anti-inflammatory immune response to infection, which means the number of mites, so it's mites that cause this disease, multiply to very large numbers on the wombat. And their immune response results in basically their skin thickening up and cracking and hair loss, and usually they become thinner and thinner and thinner, and ultimately die of like opportunistic environmental bacterial infections. So it's really severe disease on these animals, and they really go through quite significant suffering over a period of about sort of 2 to 3 months before they usually die from it. And I guess one of the things that makes it sort of publicly well recognised in Australia is that people see sick and suffering wombats, because they tend to be more likely to come out during the day, and you can see that they're visibly lost hair and that they're visibly sick. So that really drives public attention, and certainly helps us justify our research on these animals.
So are you trying to figure out how to stop the mange, or is there something unique physiologically about the wombats that, by learning about them and studying them, that's going to translate to other animals or other conditions?
Yes, very much so. So on both fronts. So wombats have very low metabolic rates, and we think that may be one of the reasons why they suffer such the severe form of the disease. I'm not 100% certain on that, but that's one of our working hypotheses. And the disease impacts lots of different animals. So in just to name a few, in North America, there's quite significant problems with black bear and eastern North America are impacted by Sarcoptic Mange, wolves in Yellowstone National Park and other carnivores there. In Europe, it really impacts things like mountain ibex and chamois is another ungulate that it impacts over there. And red foxes around the world, it's well known to impact them as well. So it's got this huge host range across mammal species. And so what we're doing with wombats is really trying to figure out ways that we can manage the disease. And it is a treatable disease, so you can apply treatments to wildlife for that. And there's a whole bunch of logistics about trying to manage a disease in a wildlife population, because they usually aren't very good patients, right? They don't really want to be captured and handled and had treatments administered to them. So there's a bunch of logistics, but what we learn with wombats we can really apply to other animals around the world as well.
Is there, you said they have a very low metabolic rate. Well, how does that affect, these mites from the Sarcoptic Mange ability to, does that mean that they have their immune system's not very tuned, or, what's the consequence of them having a slow metabolism?
Yeah, that's not well understood. So koalas also can get Sarcoptic Mange, and both of them suffer the most severe form of the disease, whereas carnivores who have high metabolic rates, like dogs and foxes, tend to suffer what we call ordinary mange in most circumstances. And so do humans. And really in those animals, the only times they get crusted mange or crusted scabies is when they are immunocompromised. Whereas wombats and koalas tend to pretty much always get crusted mange, as far as we can tell. And so we hypothesize that maybe the immune response is slower because they have these low metabolic rates, or maybe it's just not as well geared up for the more inflammatory immune responses. We're not 100% sure, and we're trying to figure that out. But I guess...
what's the benefits of a low metabolic range? Do they live longer? Or, are they able to handle heat and cold better or worse? What are all the consequences of, low versus high metabolism, let's say?
It's for wombats, having a low metabolism means that they are ecologically really able to sustain themselves during difficult environmental conditions. So because they live underground, those underground conditions are relatively stable when they're sleeping down their burrows. And then they come out and they'll feed. A healthy wombat will feed for sort of 2 to 4 hours a day. And having a low metabolic rate means that they can kind of sustain on less food for longer than other things like your kangaroos and your other macropod marsupials. And so if you have difficult environmental conditions, like it hasn't rained for a while and there's a lot of competition for food resources, wombats are a little bit better geared up to last longer during those periods of environmental stress than most other herbivores that they compete with.
Okay. So, I don't know, are you trying to just defend them against this disease? Or are you trying to understand animals like them, like koalas as well? What do you think would be a beneficial understanding that you could achieve by studying them and by studying maybe animals that are similar to them?
So I guess there's a few reasons why we're focusing on this disease and disease control. One of them is, I guess, one of the reasons. Sorry about that. I'll start that again. That was my alarm going off. There's a few why we're focusing on wombats. One of them is because it's an invasive pathogen that's been introduced by European settlers to Australia and many other places around the world. There's a question of whether it's sort of incumbent on us to actually do something about this quite significant suffering that we cause to native wildlife in our country. So that's certainly one of the reasons. Another reason is that there's already a lot of people from the general community in Australia who try to treat this disease in wombats, who see these animals suffering, want to do something about it. So one of our other reasons is to provide some good science that can be used to guide the general community who are already trying to manage this disease, but don't have the same expertise as in treating these animals as what scientists and veterinarians do. And more generally, it does cause conservation and animal welfare issues in other places around the world, and some of those are quite significant, and people are quite concerned about those in many locations. And so by advancing our capacity for disease control in wombats, we can really take what we've learned in this system and apply it to other systems to help other people also manage this disease. And there certainly is plenty of cases of that as well.
Is there anything, like truly interesting or amazing about wombats that makes them completely unique? Or are they just...
Yeah, look, I think wombats are great. I've, when I started working on them, I saw a need, and that's where what was the real justification for me starting to work on them. But I think, like all researchers, you sort of fall in love with your study animals more and more over time, and as you learn more new things about them. And one of the, wild wombats are sort of interesting in the sense that they're sort of these burrowing herbivores that sort of come out and feed at nighttime. One of their sort of really unique traits is that they are the only mammal that I know of that produce these cube-shaped poos, which is quite unique, and they basically use them as a form of communication. So wombats are quite antisocial generally, and they'll deposit little piles of cube-shaped poos next to prominent objects in their landscape. It might be a rock, it might be a log or a little rise, and that sort of thing. And they use it as a sort of a form of like social communication through the sense, so the sense of smell that is created by those. And so one of the people have always sort of asked these questions about how do wombats produce these cubes when all other feces that animals produce tend to be kind of more cylindrical. And so recently we've been doing some fun research to try and sort of understand that, and that's been quite well recognised internationally. We're sort of very fortunate to win an Ig Nobel Prize for that last year, into our research onto understanding how wombats produce cube-shaped scats.
They're literally like a cube?
They are literally like a cube. Not all of them, but a very significant proportion of them are cube-shaped.
Do they come out that way, or are they shaping them somehow and nudging them, stacking them?
Well, that's exactly been the question that we've been trying to figure out. So there's all these wonderful hypotheses about how wombats produce cube-shaped feces, and nobody had ever tested them. So some of my favourite ones are that they had a square-shaped anal sphincter. And so they'd kind of like push their feces out through that, and then it would get turned into a cube. That's wrong. There were even some extremely colourful hypotheses that wombats would pat them into shape after they had deposited them, which is also.
Well, if they're using them as signaling, then maybe they are doing that. What's wrong? I mean, if they could use them as signaling, why wouldn't they shape them? Maybe that conveys some information.
Well, they're definitely not doing it by patting them into shape physically after they've done them. So we've done a number of dissections of wombats as they've been. These are ones that have been hit by a vehicle or being euthanized by a veterinarian for other health-related reasons. And so sometimes we bring them back to my lab, and we dissect these animals. And one of the things we discovered early on is that they actually form into cubes inside the intestine, which is otherwise a sort of soft tube, and up to a metre from the anus. You get these scats that are turning into cubes. And so we've been working with some really great physicists and engineers at Georgia Tech who think about these problems in a different way to biologists, and so working together has been just really fun. And it looks like the answer is that it's a combination of the drying of the feces inside of their intestine in the lower distal colon, and the sort of the varying stretch properties around the circumference of the intestine, which is what creates that cube shape. And then they get deposited out like that. And the reason why we think they do it is because the cubes are less likely to roll away when they deposit them on an object. But we still need to do some fun experiments to test that hypothesis too. So.
Oh, you mean the cubes? They're more likely to stay in place so they can accomplish the signaling that they want.
Yeah, we think so. So we think it helps them just stay aggregated together. Is the hypothesis anyway. Of course, nobody's actually done the research on it, possibly because the research is more fun rather than applied. So.
Well, how complicated is the signaling that they do? Like, they leave them, and like, just the presence of them signals to another wombat, stay away, this is my territory, or what do you think is going on?
I think they're not territorial animals, so they don't actually defend a territory to exclude other animals. They have quite overlapping home ranges with lots of other wombats, but I think it's a form of and we don't actually know, to be completely honest, we don't know. But wombats will certainly walk around their home ranges and will visit other cube poo piles and sniff them. And so we think that it's more an advertising of who is there in an area. It may also signal things like whether somebody is reproductively active or not as well. Definitely some form of social communication. But the exact details of that are a good question.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Anything special with their mating, or are they just? I mean, does the female do very different things from the male? I mean, it'd be interesting there.
So they tend to, when the female's in heat, the male tends to spend a lot of time chasing her around in circles and biting at her. And then when they actually do mate, wombats, because they're quite rotund animals, they end up both laying on their side and at almost like a T intersection to one another to be able to make it work. So they don't sort of mount each other like a dog would or something like that.
They're like people.
Yeah. And I guess another feature of wombats that's quite unusual is, I think many people are quite familiar with kangaroos have a pouch that the joey sits in, and wombats certainly have that, but their pouch actually faces the other direction, because they're on all fours all of the time, and they dig burrows. One of their pouch opening is actually to their back end, and it's
really?
so that, yeah, it is, and it's and it makes sense, because if you're digging soil and pushing it underneath you, you don't want your pouch facing forward, because you'd start filling it up. So the joey points out backwards. So.
Really?
Yeah.
How do they reach around to get them in there? Like that would mean that they really can't help their joey very much. They would have to do it themselves. I mean, if they're so fat they can barely mate, how would they ever reach around to put anything in the pouch or take anything out? Or weird.
They don't really. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And kangaroos will certainly lick their pouches clean, but wombats don't. Birth in marsupials is basically a non-event because they give birth to a joey that's about the size of a jelly bean. So it's not the birth is very different in marsupials relative to placental mammals that give birth to much larger individuals. So marsupials give birth, and the joey basically crawls from the cloaca into the burrow. In wombats, there's a very small distance for it to crawl into there, and then attaches to the nipple inside of the pouch. And then more or less will just stay there, and the wombat will go about its thing until the joey reaches a certain size. And then it starts to come out of the pouch periodically to feed on grass. And as it becomes larger, it becomes sort of more and more independent of the pouch, but still hangs around with its mother. And a joey wombat will stay with its mother for 1.5 to 2 years in general, before it becomes solitary itself or independent.
Huh. I guess, how about comparing the pouches then to the kangaroo's pouch? How many can fit in there? How many offspring do the wombats have? I mean, if you look at pouch to pouch comparison, what are the differences or similarities there?
I guess the main difference is the direction that the pouch opens. Pouches are broadly similar between a kangaroo and a wombat. What else would I say a difference is there?
Can they accommodate the same number of offspring? Or?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yep. They both have one at a time. So you almost never see marsupials with twins in the pouch. But
I thought I had heard that in a kangaroo pouch, for instance, you'll have like maybe a very young joey, but also an older one that will not hang out in there the whole time, but return to it to feed at various points or to hang out. And then there may be a younger brother or sister that's there as well. Or is that not true?
It's not very common. What they tend to have is what we call reproductive diapause. So basically, kangaroos and wombats, they're more or less always pregnant, but they'll have an embryo that is paused essentially. And so if for some reason they lose their joey or that joey becomes independent, they usually give birth in a matter of days. Yeah, so pretty much a kangaroo or a wombat almost always has a joey in the pouch at different ages. And if they lose it, then they're pregnant. Then they'll have another one in there in a few days' time. There are some marsupials that have a lot more young. So some of your marsupial carnivores, like your koalas or your devils, actually have a litter of young. But your macropods and your wombats and your koalas tend to just have it at a time.
Well, how many animals, by the way, have pouches? I don't know if you mentioned the name of a few other ones. It's not familiar, but the wombats do, kangaroos do. What other, large marsupials do?
Pretty much all of them. The pouches vary a little bit. Like in a devil, the pouches are quite small, and same with the koala. But I'm just trying to think through if I know of any marsupials that don't have a pouch, and I'm not sure that I do, just off the top of my head.
Oh, a Tasmanian devil is I don't know much about them. You're in Tasmania, yeah. Actually, could you talk about those for maybe a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
I don't know anything about them except which is not real. Growing up and watching the cartoon from Looney Tunes, but why are they called devils? What do you know about them?
So Tasmanian devils don't spin around in circles like the cartoons, but are about these kind of like corgi-sized marsupial carnivores. They look like a little dog, really. And they're all black, and they have a couple of white stripes on them. They're not very big, but they're the top predators in Tasmania, and were formerly they formerly occurred historically on the Australian mainland as well, but were probably pushed to extinction by the introduction of the dingo about 5,000 years ago. So they're now restricted to just Tasmania, and they are mostly scavengers, but they can also be active predators as well. And what else can I tell you? What else would you like to know about Tasmanian devils?
Well, again, they're called devils because they're real strong predators? Is it because when they attack they're really vicious, or what? Why are they called devils?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're originally called Tasmanian devils is really their European name, and they were called that because at night times they have a call that sounds very ghoulish and is kind of like a rasping kind of scream. And if you don't know what it is, and you had just come to this foreign country, I imagine that's quite scary. And so that's how they picked up this name called the devil, because of the sounds that they make. But in reality, they're actually quite a small kind of dog-sized marsupial carnivore that is otherwise quite secretive. So most people never see a wild Tasmanian devil. You can go see them in wildlife parks and that sort of thing. They're otherwise quite secretive, nocturnal animals.
Okay.
And they're quite impacted by quite a unique disease, which is called Tasmanian devil facial tumour disease, which is a cancer, but it's a cancer that's transmissible. So devils that come into contact with one another during feeding or reproduction often sort of bite each other. And this cancer mostly is localized around the face and the mouth. And when they bite each other, they can actually transfer cancer cells to the other individual. And that gives that individual cancer. And that's had a huge impact on devils, and caused about an 80% decline of devils across the state over the last 20 years or 25 years. So it's quite a significant conservation issue for them, but also an extremely unusual type of pathogen impacting a wildlife species.
Do you think that means that, I know this is getting probably really esoteric, but I don't know, would a Tasmanian devil be able to give an organ transplant to another Tasmanian devil? Because they can bite each other and, one tolerate another's cells and not have an immune response to them that's strong enough to get rid of them. Perhaps that they're able to do things that, for instance, we couldn't or other animals couldn't.
Probably not. So one of the things that cancers do, because technically other cancers could be transmissible, and there are certainly cases of like surgeons working on cancers that have accidentally like stabbed themselves with a needle that's been in contact with a cancer and transmitted that to themselves. But for the most part, cancers don't have sort of the mechanisms of like transmission or to support transmission. But one of the things that cancers do to avoid the host's immune system is they downregulate these sort of molecular markers around the surface of the cells called MHC. And MHC basically is sort of a recognition marker that the immune system can tell what is yourself versus what is a bit foreign. And because these cancers have this sort of like ability to downregulate that, they basically are telling the immune system that they belong in that host as well. So if you were to transplant an organ, however, they wouldn't, they behave differently. They would be recognized by the immune system and would be attacked by the host's immune system. And the only way you could regulate that, like with humans, would be to give like immune suppressants.
I just thought it was a special case that they could transfer cancer. I didn't know that it could be transferred in certain occasions in people and other animals. That's why I thought that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, no, it's a good question. So,
do you see any? Do you know of any scientists that focus on the physiology and the various aspects of pouches or marsupials? Is there something you feel that maybe it's a unique structure? There's probably a lot of learnings that could be achieved there by studying them. Do you study them, or do you know anyone that does?
Yeah, it's not my area of super strong expertise, but I've got some colleagues that I could recommend, and if who can probably speak to it better than I can, or who could probably point you on to other people as well, and that sort of thing. So I'd be happy to suggest people.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Scott, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and to get in contact?
I guess probably the best ways are through, if they want to follow the actual research publications, things like Google Scholar, that they seem to do the best job at keeping up to date with those sorts of things. And my university website would be the other one, and I usually seem to garnish a reasonable amount of fun sort of media communication. So just Googling my name and usually brings up some links that people can look at as well.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. And I know you're coming from far, far away, and it's probably an unusual time for you. So thank you.
No problem. Well, thanks a lot for having me, Richard. I really appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.